guy's been trying to strangle me for 10 years. He'll succeed one of these days. Talking about current peace negotiations is obviously speculation. My assumption in general is that policy decisions grow out of interests. The interests are rooted in institutional structures. These don't really change very much over long periods. And in fact, U.S. policy on this issue grows out of commitments and concerns and attitudes and ideology that go way back, in fact, back to the 1920s when the U.S. became involved in the region. I'm not going to try to, and I really think, I hope this doesn't seem too far out of line to you, but I would like to sketch just a couple of the high points of the background, which is very much misunderstood. I don't know of any topic which has been so grossly misreported, not only in the press, but in the scholarly literature and elsewhere. I'm not going to obviously give footnotes, but if you're interested, I'd be happy to refer you to some sources. I think to understand the current situation, we really have to see out of what it grew. Let's just go back to 1967. In 1967, in November 1967, there was the major UN, the first major UN Security Council resolution was passed, UN 242, that expressed a certain international consensus on how the conflict ought to be settled. Now, like every resolution, this one was left a little vague so that everybody could sign it, interpreting it their own way. And there are several interpretations, but we understand pretty well what the interpretations were. And in fact, even in the last few months, some new and important documentation has come out about the actual U.S. position at that time. I'm sure you all know this, but the resolution called for a settlement on the Green Line, the former internationally recognized borders, the pre-June borders, with possibly some minor modifications. And the U.S. position, and in fact the world position, was that if there were modifications, they would have to be mutual adjustments. In fact, the Arab states agreed to sign the UN agreed to U242. We now know, and we didn't know as recently as 8 months ago, because they received assurances from the U.S. negotiator Arthur Goldberg and Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, who's recently reconfirmed this, and the State Department, again, recently reconfirmed that the U.S. would support mutual adjustments if there were, which would in any event be minor. So in effect, a settlement on the pre-June 67 borders, the Green Line. That was also the position of essentially pretty much the entire world. Notice that the UN 242 offered nothing to the Palestinians. I mean, they're mentioned only as refugees. And that, in fact, was the international consensus of the time, including the Arab states. The U.S. position was firmed up in December 1969 with the Rogers Plan. Rogers was Secretary Rogers, Secretary of State, which just repeated what I just said, basically. And that was the official U.S. position, and we know from the documentary record that that was also the internal position. Now, that remained so until February 1971. In February 1971, an extremely important event took place. It's kind of out of history, but it took place. The UN had a mediator, Gunnar Jarring, who was trying to establish a settlement, and Jarring made a proposal pretty much along the lines of UN 242, in fact, almost as interpreted as I just described it, and President Sadat of Egypt accepted it. Israel's response, then he went over to Israel. Israel's response was that they welcomed President Sadat's offer of it as a genuine peace offer, but they decided to reject it. We know from internal discussion in Hebrew literature that they felt that if they held out, they could get much better territorial concessions. At that point, the U.S. had to make a decision. The U.S. is overwhelmingly the dominant power in the region. After the Second World War, the U.S. in effect extended the Monroe Doctrine to the Middle East, which is a very important fact, incidentally. In fact, part of the significance of the Gulf War is that the Gulf War, there was a change. For the first time, Europe has essentially accepted this. They've excluded themselves and accepted that this is U.S. turf and they're not allowed to interfere, which is a change and a significant one. But in any event, the U.S. was the overwhelmingly powerful actor there. And the U.S. had to make a decision. Is the U.S. going to support its own official policy, or is it going to back Israel? And there was a policy split over that. The policy split was more or less symbolized by an open conflict between William Rogers, Secretary of State, and Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor. Kissinger's position was what he called stalemate, no changes, which just freeze things the way they are. There were all kinds of reasons for this, ranging from personal to strategic. But anyway, that was the conflict. Kissinger won. The U.S. decided to back Israel's rejection of the 1971 offer, and that was the first time that the peace process was aborted. Now, that also, incidentally, by accident, happens to be the month when George Bush reached national prominence, appointed as UN ambassador. From then till today, the U.S. has continued to block every step, every effort towards peace. Every effort to achieve peace has been blocked by the United States. It has adhered to this position. There is not the slightest evidence that George Bush ever had the slightest qualms about this, or that he does today. I mention that because I think it bears on what's happening now. Kissinger assumed, as the U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence assumed, that Israel was overwhelmingly powerful. This was a period of tremendous triumphalism. The head of Israeli military intelligence, Yoshafat Harkabi, who now is a dove, was then an extreme hawk and expressed the position saying that war is not the Arabs' game. We don't have to worry about that anymore. And that was the standard view. Tremendous triumphalism. It was assumed that Israel could just maintain its position and nobody would bother them. And Ariel Sharon, the right-wing general, stated at the time that Israel could conquer everything from Baghdad to Khartoum to Morocco in a week if they wanted to, but they don't want to. And that was the general understanding. On those grounds, Kissinger's, along with the big strategic conception behind it, Kissinger's position is understandable. And I stress again, the U.S. has not veered from that position since, except in detail, and I don't think is veering from it now. The Kissinger's backing of Israel's refusal of any diplomatic moves, which continued, that led directly to the 1973 war. Egypt continued to warn, Sadat continued to warn that if the U.S. blocked every diplomatic initiative, they would have no recourse but to go to war. Nobody took them seriously. Everybody laughed. 1973 war came along, and it was understood that it wasn't a joke. War was the Arabs' game, but a pretty close call. Well, at that point, the United States made a tactical modification of policy. Since Egypt could not be ignored, it wasn't a basket case, you go to the fallback position. Fallback position is absorb them into the U.S. system. For years, Sadat had been offering to make Egypt a U.S. client state. That's all he wanted, just make us your client state. So Kissinger agreed to that. The United States agreed to that, finally, after the war, and moved to the position, to a very natural fallback position. You can't ignore them, therefore marginalize them. And that leads to the next step, which was consummated at Camp David in 1978-79. Exclude Egypt from the conflict, since we can't ignore them. Exclude them from the conflict, which means a Sinai settlement. Increase military and economic support to Israel. Back Israel in its plans to integrate the occupied territories and attack its northern neighbor, Lebanon. That was the obvious meaning of Kissinger's diplomacy and of the Camp David agreement. Whether Jimmy Carter understood it or not, I don't know, but it was certainly the obvious meaning. Egypt was the only Arab deterrent. If you eliminate them from the conflict and you give Israel a huge increase in support, of course they're going to do exactly what they intended to do. What else could happen? And what they intended to do was exactly what they did, move to integrate the occupied territories and invade Lebanon, which was done in 1978, and then extensive bombing through the next couple of years, and then again in 1982, as you know. Well, what was predictable happened, not surprisingly, and we now, meanwhile, another event had taken place, a diplomatic non-event had taken place of some significance. In January 1976, another event took place that's out of history, but real and important. In January 1976, the UN Security Council debated a resolution which updated 242. In effect, it updated 242 by essentially the same as 242, except it added one thing, namely Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, that reflected a changed international consensus having to do with the Palestinian movement and all sorts of things. But by then, virtually the entire world had shifted its position. It adopted the same position on borders, but with a Palestinian state in the occupied territories instead of returning the West Bank to Jordan and the Gaza Strip to Egypt, which it had administered before. That resolution was brought to the Security Council by the Arab confrontation states, so-called, by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. It was publicly supported by the PLO, and according to Israel's delegation, Chaim Herzog was then ambassador, it was actually prepared by the PLO. That I can't know for sure, but it was certainly publicly supported by them. It was supported by the whole world. The United States vetoed it. That ended that. That's the next step in destruction of the peace process. The U.S. was not going to accept this modification of UN 242, which recognized Palestinian self-determination, even though at that point the U.S. was moving to integrate Egypt within the U.S. orbit, to accept Sadat's offer to make it a client state and to exclude it from the conflict with the Sinai settlement so that Israel could then go on to do what it continued to do. Well, that continued. There's a little deviation now and then, but basically that continued. The U.S. vetoed a similar resolution in 1980. There was a series of proposals through the early 80s from Arab states, from the PLO, from the European community, from just about every source, to try to move towards a diplomatic settlement. Israel refused. The U.S. rejected it flat out. No moves on this, hence no peace process. There has been no peace process since February 1971 for exactly this reason. You can see, if you without running through the whole record, you can see what it means if you look at the UN record. It's almost never published, but the facts are very dramatic. The Security Council is out because the U.S. has already made it clear it'll veto anything. The General Assembly, there's no technical veto, but of course if the U.S. votes against something, it amounts to a veto given its power. There's a vote every year. Every winter session of the UN, there's a vote which essentially reiterates the content of these resolutions. The vote passes, well, December 1990 was the most recent one. It was 144 to 2. December 1989, it was 151 to 3. For some unexplained reason, Dominica joined the United States and Israel, probably some payoff. In 1988, it was 138 to 2, and that's the way it is every year. That's the peace process. Nothing can happen as long as the U.S. blocks it, and the U.S. has always blocked the peace process. Well, the U.S. was quite pleased with the status quo, accepted the status quo up until early 1988. When the Intifada broke out, it was beginning to cause unacceptable costs to Israel, and that means to the United States, Israel's U.S. client. And there were problems. One problem was just the cost of one problem was the PR cost. For the first time, some information started coming out about, in fact, what had always been going on. It was getting harder to suppress. So the press was giving, for a couple of months at least, some indication of the regular events in that in the occupied territories and the character of the occupation and so on, and made it very hard to maintain the pretense of a benign occupation and all that stuff. Furthermore, it was just plain costly. Israel's army was virtually dissociated from every action except suppressing the Intifada, which was pretty tricky for them. It was costing the U.S. It was also a diplomatic cost. It was becoming harder and harder to suppress the PLO's offers. Now, right through the 80s, there continued to be offers from Yasser Arafat and the PLO calling for negotiations leading to mutual recognition. The American press, with just astonishing discipline, didn't report these things. New York Times was an absolute blackout, refused totally. Other papers, you'd occasionally get a little hint of it here and there. It's quite a remarkable story. I have a full record of it if you're interested. Anyhow, by 1988, it was getting really hard. I mean, the offers were very insistent. They were very clear. They were very public. They were being made, all over Europe, and you just couldn't. It's getting harder and harder to pretend it wasn't happening. By the end of 1988, the U.S. was really getting into a bind. You remember back then, the United States was claiming that Arafat had not yet said the magic words. He hadn't repeated, we told him to say XYZ, and he said, XYZW or something, and therefore we couldn't proceed. Well, the United States was becoming a laughing stock. Literally, it was becoming a diplomatic joke in Europe and elsewhere, with George Shultz going around about how you haven't said the magic words, we can't talk to them. It reached a real danger point in November, December 1988. The United States refused to allow Arafat to speak at the UN. The UN moved to Geneva, which is a real slap in the face. Spoke there. At that point, the U.S. decided to move to another fallback position, and that brings us into the contemporary period. The decision was to pretend that Arafat had taken the U.S. position, said the magic words, and then to insist that that's their stand because we say so. In fact, what Arafat said at that famous press conference was as different from the U.S. position as it had always been, and no Palestinian spokesman could possibly take the U.S. position, which was hopeless. But the U.S. is a very powerful state, sort of dominates the international propaganda apparatus, and once the U.S. announced Arafat had taken our position, that became the fact, even though it wasn't true. PLO accepted it too, sort of, I should say. After the pretense that Arafat had said the magic words, the U.S. then gave them the reward. The reward was that they could start low-level negotiations with the U.S. ambassador in Tunis. That was the so-called dialogue. The purpose of the dialogue was extremely clear. The first meeting of the dialogue was leaked and published in Egypt and published in Israel, and in fact even published in the English language press in Israel, which meant that every reporter read it. And what it said is this: the U.S. announced its position in the first meeting. The position was, no American newspaper was willing to touch this, I should say. The U.S. position was announced in the first meeting. It said, we have two demands. Demand number one, there will be no international conference, so forget about it, no peace process. Demand number two, call off the Intifada, which we regard as terrorism against, they say call off the riots, which we regard as terrorism against the state of Israel. So in other words, forget about any peace process, return to the previous status quo, and then we'll be willing to talk to you. That was the U.S. position. Israel understood perfectly what was going on. 2 months later, in February 1989, this was the Labor Party government at the time, the Minister of Defense, Yitzhak Rabin, who was responsible for the occupied territories, had a meeting with 5 Peace Now leaders in Israel. And it was reported in the Hebrew press. He told them, don't worry about the dialogue. It's a good thing. We're not opposed to it. It's a low-level dialogue, which has absolutely no meaning. The point of the dialogue is to give us, he said, a year or more to crush the Intifada by force. And we will do it. And he said, they will be crushed. Don't worry about it. If the Peace Now leaders had any objection to this, it wasn't reported. The only thing they were reported to have said was various tactical questions about whether it was going to work. Well, that was the Israeli understanding, and it was also the U.S. government understanding. And that was the role of the dialogue. Keep things quiet so Israel can step up the pressure while the world's attention is directed elsewhere, and they will be crushed, which is incidentally what happened within about a year, in fact. Meanwhile, to deflect the danger of any further diplomatic moves, the U.S. and Israel initiated their own diplomatic initiative. That came in May 1989 with what's called the Shamir plan, although bear in mind that there was then a Labor-Likud coalition government, and it was actually the coalition plan. It was the Shamir-Perez plan. That was announced in May 1989. That's the official U.S.-Israeli plan. It's also the official U.S. government plan, because the United States announced immediately that we were going to support the Shamir plan. That was the only plan on the table, as James Baker put it. The Baker plan came out a couple of months later, officially, the State Department bulletin. It said the only issue under discussion, the only topic under discussion is the Shamir plan. Any Palestinians who are permitted into negotiations will be allowed to discuss the modalities of the Shamir plan and nothing else. That's the official Baker plan, official U.S. policy, December 1989. Well, what's the Shamir plan? Its terms have never been published in the American press, except the marginal press, the magazine or something. Although it's there, you can get a copy of it from the Israeli embassy if you like, or you can read it in, alternative press publications. And it is official U.S. government policy. It says it has three basic premises. Basic premise number one is there can be no additional Palestinian state. That means there already is a Palestinian state. It's Jordan. There can't be an additional Palestinian state. So there's no issue of Palestinian self-determination, contrary to what the Palestinians and the Jordanians and the rest of the world mistakenly believe. We have established that fact. And when the U.S. takes a position, that does establish the fact. I mean, that's the way power works. So point number one, there can be no additional Palestinian state in addition to Jordan. Point number two, I'm quoting, there can be no change in the status of the occupied territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, except in accordance with the basic guidelines of the Israeli government. And you know what they are. Point number three, basic premise number three, the PLO is excluded, meaning Palestinians are not even permitted to choose their own representatives to sign the capitulation. Then point number four, which is the forthcoming one, says there will be what they call free elections held under Israeli military occupation, with the Palestinian leadership rotting in jail, under administrative detention. Well, if anybody else were to propose something like that, we wouldn't even bother laughing. We'd probably nuke them or something. But the fourth point is the one that was made public and tremendously forthcoming. We're going to allow free elections under military occupation. That's the Shamir Perez plan. That's the Baker plan. Well, that carries us up until 1990, and since then it's simply been reiterated. The Gulf War comes along. Its major effect was to establish U.S. forceful hegemony over the region. Something you pointed out correctly, that this was a preventable war, but the U.S. had a big stake in ensuring that war wasn't prevented. That established the rule of force in the region, and the rule of diplomatic settlement would have been of no use to the United States. Looked like there were real possibilities for a diplomatic settlement. The U.S. would not permit it. It had to be settled by force. That's our strong card. You naturally play your strong card. The end result was establishment of the principle that this is U.S. turf. Nobody interferes, nobody indigenous, nobody foreign. Europe has kind of backed off and withdrawn, and now the U.S. runs it unilaterally. Well, we now come up to Madrid. Looking back over the record, there are two reasons why the U.S. has vetoed every Security Council resolution and, in effect, vetoed every General Assembly resolution by voting against it, which amounts to a veto. They always have 2 points which are unacceptable to the United States. Point number one is there'll be an international conference. Now, the U.S. won't accept that because this is U.S. turf. Nobody's allowed in, certainly not our rival. Kissinger, incidentally, made that very clear in private discussions that were then leaked through the Freedom of Information Act. He said that a major commitment of his diplomacy was to keep Europe and Japan out of any involvement in the Middle East, and that makes sense. Control over, dominance over the major energy resources of the world is an extremely powerful lever in world affairs, quite apart from the huge profits that flow from it, and the U.S. wants that for itself. That's one of the ways you keep your rivals under control. So no Europe and Japan. It's our place, the Monroe Doctrine. So that's point one. Point two is that the peace process, as the world has seen it, has always called for Palestinian self-determination in some fashion, state or whatever, and the U.S. is against that. The U.S. is opposed to it. I'll come back to why, but it is definitely opposed to it. There's not the slightest indication of any modification on this, and I think the reasons are deeply rooted. And therefore, the U.S. has had to stop every effort at a peace process and has done so. That comes right up till today. Well, what happens when we come to Madrid? Notice that the two U.S. conditions are satisfied. It is a unilateral conference. Nobody else is allowed in. I mean, the Russians, Gorbachev was invited, but that was a joke. That's just to make it, the only reason Gorbachev was invited because he was the powerless leader of a non-existent state. So therefore, you could have editorials calling it an international conference. But anybody who existed was not going to be allowed in. Again, sort of not very subtle point. It's a U.S.-run unilateral initiative. People do what the U.S. says. So that satisfies point number one. As far as point number two is concerned, there is no even nod given to any matter of Palestinian self-determination. What the Palestinians are being offered is essentially the Shamir plan. Now, the Shamir plan has a couple of variations. Labor and Likud, the two major parties over the years, have had slightly different interpretations of how to maintain control over the territories. The Likud, which is called the hawkish group, nobody calls for annexation. Very important to bear that in mind. Nobody has ever, even the most, greater Israel enthusiasts don't call for annexation. There's a very well understood reason for that. It's constantly discussed in the Israeli press, but it's perfectly understandable. If you annex the territories, it is necessary to extend Israeli law to them, and that means you have to provide to the population the minimal services that are available to second-class citizens within Israel. And that's a very expensive business. Like Arabs in Israel, Israeli Arab citizens are second class, but there's some limits, like they can't just die in the streets and that sort of thing. So there's minimal standards that are offered them, and nobody wants to pay the cost of extending that to the population in the territories. The current situation is much better. They're very heavily taxed, and they're given no services in return. So that's perfect. And therefore, you don't want to extend, you don't want to annex. Therefore, they have this ambiguous phrase, extend sovereignty. Nobody knows exactly what that means. But that's the hawkish position. The dovish position, what's here called the dovish position, the Labor Party position, is something called territorial compromise, or land for peace, which sounds very nice until you look at what it means. And what it means is basically the same as the Likud position. It means Israel takes whatever it wants in the occupied territories, takes the usable land, the resources, the Jordan Valley, any of the suburbs around, what are in effect the Tel Aviv, Jerusalem suburbs and the hills, takes whatever it likes, but it does not take responsibility for the heavy Arab population concentrations. It's like it doesn't take Nablus. Well, that's just another way of saying we take what we feel like, but we don't want responsibility for the population. The population can either be stateless or they can be administered by Jordan, but we don't want responsibility for them. That's called land for peace and territorial compromise. When you see those nice words, that's what they mean. The difference between the Likud and the Labor position is very slight. In fact, plenty of Palestinian nationalists, and in fact even Israeli doves, regard the Likud position as better. The Likud position is autonomy, under Israeli sovereignty. And their assumption is, so for example, Shmuel Toledano is kind of a Labor dove, says the Likud position is better because at least Israel has some kind of responsibility for the population, whereas under the Labor territorial compromise position, population can just drop dead. Nobody has any responsibility for them. And in fact, the worst thing in the world is to be stateless. Nothing worse than that. And those are the choices. The U.S. is now pressing either land for peace or autonomy. That's one or the other of these two positions. It's very slightly different. The definition of autonomy was given rather succinctly by one of the best Israeli journalists, Danny Rubenstein, in Haaretz, which is kind of like the New York Times, the official paper. He's a very good journalist. He's not no particular dove, incidentally. He's pretty mainstream. But he's been doing some of the best coverage of the occupied territories for years, and he knows Israeli policy well, and a couple articles recently in which he pointed out that what Israel and the United States are offering the Palestinians, he said, is autonomy, but it's the autonomy of a POW camp, in which the prisoners are autonomous to cook their own meals and run their own cultural events, and that's the end of it. We're not going to under autonomy, they get nothing. In fact, what he ended up saying, under autonomy, they're going to have about what they have now. Run their own educational system, run their own health services, because Israel doesn't want to pay for it. And that'll be called autonomy. Meanwhile, Israel will pick up what it likes. And that's the U.S. position, too, as far as I know. If there's any modification of U.S. policy on this, I haven't found one particle of evidence for it. So my assumption is that that's the way it stands, the way it's been for years. The reason the U.S. is pushing the peace process now is so-called peace process. I mean, in my view, it's a war process, is twofold. First of all, it looks like there might be an opportunity to advance the traditional U.S. rejectionism, to really move it a couple of steps forward. It's a unilateral conference. Nobody else is allowed in. It's based on the U.S. principle that there can't be any Palestinian self-determination. And maybe you can make some progress on this. Maybe after the Gulf War, the leaders of the Arab oil monarchies monarchies will be able to be more public in what has always been their tacit support for Israeli power. That's one of the hidden secrets of the region, that there's always been a kind of a tacit alliance between the monarchs who run the oil system for the United States and England and Israel, which is part of the protective apparatus. It goes back to the 1960s. But they've never been able to do it publicly because there's too much public, pressure. For Palestinians were always a live issue, the unresolved nationalist issue. And one feeling is, well, after the Gulf War, secular nationalism is discredited and people are, sort of destroyed, smashed up, so maybe you can move this a couple of steps forward. The other reason is that the U.S. administration desperately needs a political victory, a significant political victory. There are a lot of reasons for this, but the most obvious is that the Gulf War was a total catastrophe from the point of view of the United States itself. The end result of the war is unacceptable politically. The U.S., remember, first of all, it killed a couple 100,000 people and destroyed the place, and they ended up supporting Saddam Hussein. In fact, the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein as he crushed the popular rebellions, the Shiite and the Kurdish rebellions, and that was for good reasons, which were for once explained in the press. The reasons were that, as Thomas Friedman, the chief diplomatic correspondent of the Times, put it, the U.S. wants to achieve the best of all worlds. The best of all worlds would be a military junta in Iraq, which would wield the iron fist just the way Saddam Hussein did prior to August 1990, much to the satisfaction of the U.S. allies, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and of course the boss in Washington. He didn't add the last phrase, but that's tacit. That is the U.S. position. Therefore, the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein as he crushed the rebellions, and we did support him. It reached the point where Iraqi generals trying to join the Shiite rebellion pleaded with American military a couple of miles away not to do anything, just to allow them to have Iraqi captured equipment that they could use in the fight against Saddam Hussein, and General Schwarzkopf refused. George Bush was off fishing. That was the U.S. position, and it doesn't look pretty. It's going to be pretty hard to sell politically. So you have to show that some great thing happened as a result of this, and there's been a huge propaganda campaign about how, well, maybe we didn't do too well in the Gulf, didn't come out perfect, but we can still win this sweet victory. We're now going to advance the peace process, so on. So there are domestic political reasons, and there are just strategic reasons of advancing traditional policies. So the U.S. certainly wants to push this as much as possible, and that's where we now stand. Now, what's the reasoning that lies behind it? Well, I don't think that's very obscure. Like I said, that goes back to the 1920s. In fact, it kind of goes back to British imperialism, which the U.S. took over for after the Second World War. The British imperial managers, back at the time of the First World War, recognized that it was going to be economically and politically and militarily impossible for them to run the region as colonies. It was just, they didn't have the forces or the economic strength or whatever. So Lord Curzon and the Parliamentary Committee and so on, you look back at their records, internal records, now pretty well public, they concluded that what Britain ought to do is establish what they call an Arab facade. That is, a facade of Arab rulers behind whom the imperial power Britain would run the show. And as Lord Curzon put it, Britain should disguise absorption of the colonies under convenient fictions such as buffer state or sphere of influence or something like that. In other words, set up effectively a colonial system, but behind an Arab facade. Well, when the U.S. took over the same scene after the Second World War, incidentally kicking Britain out, which it didn't want to do, but the U.S. was the stronger of the two. When the U.S. took over, it essentially adopted the same strategic conception. The main interest is control over the oil system. It's not that the U.S. needs the oil. I mean, the U.S. could be on solar energy and we'd have the same policies. In fact, until around 1970, we were an exporter. We were the world's largest exporter in North America. So it's not that the U.S. needs the oil, but what it does need is the leverage and the profits. And again, the documentary record, insofar as it's available, makes it very clear that all tremendous profits come out of oil production, and you got to make sure that they flow to the economies of the United States and its British client, which is what it is. So Kuwaiti investments are in London, and Saudi Arabian profits come back to, Treasury securities and prop up the U.S. economy and so on. That's a very important one thing that maintains the wealth and integrity of the U.S. economy, which is quite a serious problem now. I mean, I don't have to tell you. So for those reasons, the U.S. has got to ensure that the energy system remains under U.S. control. You can't, it's just not cost effective to try to run it directly, so we have an Arab facade. The Arab facade is the family dictatorships who were handed the management of the energy system in the Anglo-American imperial settlement. They've got to be protected against any threat. The threats are all indigenous. There's no threat from anywhere else. They have to be protected against nationalist movements and uprisings and so on. How do you protect your Arab facade? The various dictators and tyrants who manage the system for you. Well, there's two levels of protection. One level is a group of regional enforcers, preferably non-Arab, because non-Arabs just find it easier to kill Arabs. So there's a periphery of regional enforcers. It includes Turkey, Israel, Iran under the Shah, Pakistan, which provides a kind of Praetorian guard for the Saudi elite, and so on. Their job is to protect the facade from the population. That's how the U.S. relation with Israel actually got firmed up in the 1960s. Israel was regarded by U.S. intelligence as a barrier against Arab nationalist pressure against the Gulf rulers, coming from Nasser at that time. That's when the Israeli-Saudi alliance got essentially established. Iran had some problems when the Shah was lost, but they'd like to work that one back in. Well, that's the second level. And then in the background, there's British and American muscle, in case anything really goes wrong. Come in. The two violent warrior states come in and take care of things in case you get in trouble. Well, now, in that strategic conception, as far as I can see, has not changed at all. Beyond that, there's only tactical judgments as to how to work it out. Now, in that system, people, some state, say, or a group, has value insofar as they contribute to the system. Well, who has value? Naturally, the Arab facade. The family dictatorships have value because they manage it for us. They're the facade. The enforcer states, like Turkey and Israel and so on, they have value because, they're the local muscle. U.S. obviously has value. We don't have to worry about that. What about Palestinians? They offer nothing to the system. They don't have wealth. They don't have power. Actually, they're negative because they're a disruptive element that stirs up nationalist forces. As a result, they simply have no rights. I mean, it's kind of elementary. If you don't contribute something to power, you have no human rights. That's just statecraft, it's called. So accordingly, it's entirely natural that the U.S. should always oppose any form of Palestinian self-determination, and it does. And as far as I can see, it still does. Well, we're now up till today, and my picture is that Danny Rubenstein's story is essentially correct, that the U.S. and Israel intend to offer either some kind of autonomy or maybe call it territorial compromise, which will ensure that Israel has central control of whatever it needs or wants in the territories. I think this, if it can be achieved, it will be, in my view, with the not only acceptance but even approval of the tyrants who rule the oil system, the Arab tyrannies, and of course the other enforcer states, Turkey and so on, with the U.S. in the background. Well, whether it can work or not, that's now we're in the area of speculation. But if there's a change from this framework, I haven't seen any evidence of it.
Open up for questions, and people should feel free during questions to answer if they want to start up.
Is Shiite fundamentalism, does that represent the threat to this system?
It's one of the threats. I mean, it's not just Shiite fundamentalism, but various forms of religious fundamentalism have developed and are pretty powerful in the region, all over North Africa. You saw what just happened in Algeria. And that's natural, too. I mean, as secular nationalism fails, people turn to other forms of identification. Religious fundamentalism is another one. That shouldn't look too strange to us because the same thing's happening in the United States. In the United States, secular democracy is failing. More and more people feel that the political system has nothing to do with them. You can see that in polls and studies and so on, and you get the natural result, a very sharp increase in religious fundamentalism, which is just extraordinary in the United States. The United States is off the chart as compared with any other industrial society in this respect. And what's happening here is, kind of a lesser fashion, what's happening in the Middle East too, and I think for the same reason. The PLO, for example, was secular nationalism. Other forms of secular nationalism have failed. Nasser, for example. They couldn't get what they wanted, the West wouldn't allow it, and so on and so forth. So people turned to fundamentalism. What's more, the West and Israel have actually supported that. That was a bad tactical error, but they supported it. They didn't realize what they were doing. But in Lebanon, for example, Israel, when it was trying to control Lebanon, Israel tried to destroy the secular nationalists. That's what the war was about. You want to destroy the PLO so they don't trouble you with all these negotiations offers and things. And what they instigated was what people call the Shiite fundamentalism. That was the alternative. Well, Israel really had a tiger by the tail on that one, and the Shiite fundamentalist resistance drove them out of the country. They weren't counting on people who are going to be suicide bombers who go in and blow up your military camp and so on. The same thing is happening in the occupied territories. For the first, at least year and a half of the Intifada, Israel was almost openly supporting Hamas, the fundamentalist movement. The leader of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin in Gaza, who was a violent anti-Semite, kill the Jews and so on, he was given very nice treatment. They liked him. Young fundamentalist militants were being bussed in by Israel to West Bank universities to break up demonstrations by secular students. And the logic was the same. The logic is the real threat is secular nationalism. The real threat is people who would be willing to negotiate and so on. We can do just fine with these guys who say kill all the Jews because we have no problem about dealing with them. Well, again, they kind of got a tiger by the tail on that one too. And I don't know how happy they are that this is what they were doing because once you get these forces going, they go in directions that are hard to control. And it's happening in Algeria. That's why they had to cancel the elections. And yes, this is happening all throughout the region. I think the causes are pretty obvious, and it's very likely to continue as long as there's no possibility of realizing the aims of reform, which is drastically needed. Not only political reform and social reform is just, a huge priority there. If it can't be reached, people are going to turn to other forms of struggle, and they may be pretty crazy.
And secondly, the U.S. goal in the Gulf War was to establish a force. In what sense was the war a catastrophe?
It was a political catastrophe. It was a political catastrophe because it was impossible to cover up the fact that the U.S. ended up supporting Saddam Hussein exactly as it had been supporting him up till August 1990. It takes a lot of effort to suppress the fact that the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein as he put down the popular uprisings, and furthermore that the U.S. is supporting the Emir of Kuwait as he destroys the democratic initiatives that were being developed there. And the U.S. position was to block any democratic opening. The State Department even conceded that George Bush refused to use the word democracy even in private communications to the Emir of Kuwait because they thought that'd be too much interference in their internal affairs. We're very delicate about those matters. It's kind of hard to cover up. Yes, the rule of force was established, but the political outcome is extremely hard to deal with. Especially after, it was interesting the way you remember, like last March and so on. The suppression of the Shiites was easy to handle. They're just dirty Arabs. You want to kill them, that's no business. The Kurds was a harder problem. The kids have blue eyes and kind of Aryan features and that sort of thing. And therefore there was some, the Kurdish suppression got a big play. And after the big fuss about Saddam, this monster, so on, then he goes around killing the Kurds, these Aryans. For the U.S. to be backing it up, that was too much even for the media to handle, so they kind of had some problems with that one. It was interesting the way they did handle it, and describe it if you like, but one of the ways they handled it was by flat out lying about the Arab states. You read the New York Times, you read it closely, they say, well, it's kind of unpleasant, but we got to do this, we have to do it for stability, and there's unanimity among the Arab clients over this. That was the report in the New York Times. The main report was April 10th from Damascus. Alan Cowell was a Middle East correspondent. Just out of curiosity, I looked at the Egyptian press the day before, April 9th in the Egyptian press. Egypt is the only one of the clients that even exists. I mean, of the other Arab states, 6 of them are family dictatorships, the United States. The 7th is Syria, run by Hafiz al-Assad, who's indistinguishable from Saddam Hussein. Egypt's a tyranny, but kind of a soft tyranny by standards of the region. And there's some openness there. So naturally, you want to find out about this unanimity, you look at the Egyptian press, well, Al-Ahram, kind of like the Egyptian New York Times. The day before that report about the unanimity in the Arab states, Al-Ahram had a huge article by the deputy editor denouncing the United States for supporting Saddam Hussein in the crushing of the rebellions, and saying this just proves what we've been saying all along, that the only U.S. interest in the region was to destroy and weaken the Arab world and reinstate its own authority. All right, next day, New York Times tells you, all the Arab states agree with us, much as we don't like it. We got to have stability, so we suppress, back Saddam Hussein and try to get the best of all worlds. Okay, so there's that. Now, what about Europe and Japan? Well, I think part of the thing is they recognize reality. The U.S. was always somewhat deterred in the use of military force. The U.S. has always been the dominant military power, and there used to be a deterrent. Soviet Union. Whatever you think of it, doesn't matter. It was a deterrent. 10 years earlier, the U.S. and Britain wouldn't have dared to put 500,000 troops in the field because it would have been too dangerous. You get into trouble. In fact, every Middle East war since 1958 the U.S. invasion of Lebanon, has come close to a nuclear war. There was always a threat of nuclear war, and sometimes it was not far. McNamara, for example, who was then Secretary of Defense, said that in 1967, in his words, we damn near had war, as there was a confrontation between the Russian and American fleets, and the American fleet turned around some Russian vessels, and the same thing happened every time. So you had to back off. It was just too dangerous. With the Russians gone from the scene, the U.S. and Britain could resort to their traditional stand. You just use arbitrary force against defenseless enemies, and that frees up a lot of options. And that was demonstrated in the Gulf. So Europe and Japan recognize it, but I suspect there's another factor. I can't prove this, but here's what I'd recommend that you keep your eyes on. The collapse of the Soviet Union, what that really means is that the whole Eastern Bloc is being restored to its traditional role as a colony of Western Europe. Remember that whole region prior to the Bolshevik Revolution and then the Iron Curtain, most of that region, not all of it, like not Czechoslovakia, but most of the region was a colony of the West. It was third world, kind of deep third world. The Bolshevik Revolution pulled it out, moved in its own direction. It was, one of these, it was kind of like Grenada in a way, except a huge Grenada. It was a move towards independence, but in this case on the part of a huge part of the third world, not a little speck. And the reaction was the same as always. You got to stop it. Grenada, you knock them off on a weekend. This one took 70 years, but it's done. And now the area is reverting to its traditional status. You impose IMF structural adjustment and turn to the standard two-tiered societies, and they're open to exploitation. The problem for the U.S. is not happy about this. And the reason is that after the last 10 years, when the U.S. economy suffered a rather severe blow under Reagan-Bush economic policies, the U.S. is a deeply indebted country. We used to be capital rich just 10 years ago. We're now capital poor. The U.S. cannot participate in the robbery of Eastern Europe. That's going to be the Germans are going to play that. They're way ahead. And if there's any more opportunities, the Japanese will move in. So far, they're waiting to see if it's going to pay off. But the U.S. can't get in that game, where there's much indebtedness at every level, federal, state, corporate, even household debt. That's the result of the economic policies of the last 10 years. That means that's why the U.S. is always dragging its feet. Like just last August, remember, Bush made a speech kind of pleading with Ukraine not to move towards independence, and that's been going on all through the decade for this reason. But one likely concomitant to this, I kind of suspect it's going on, though I don't have any evidence, is that Europe, meaning Germany and its periphery, is probably moving towards an oil deal with Russia. That would be the natural thing for them to do. I mean, Russia is now a big third world country with a lot of resources that can be robbed, and it has plenty of oil. You know, they need Western technology, but Germany and Japan give them the technology. And if that worked, I'm really just guessing. I don't see any evidence for it, but it seems to me it's kind of like in the cards. And if that happens, Europe and Japan's concern for the Middle East will decline because they'll have another source of resources. It's not just oil, but minerals and everything else. In fact, all of the third world resources that the U.S. has largely dominated, that situation is going to change with this big new third world coming along, rich in resources, plenty of opportunities for investment, you know, a lot of cheap labor and so on and so forth. And if indeed Germany and its periphery and probably later Japan move in to exploit that region, that'll change the balance of the world system considerably, and it'll possibly lessen their interest in the Middle East. So I suspect that's kind of like a secondary factor. But as I say, that's real speculation. I haven't seen any evidence for that yet.
Picture of the Middle East or the future and what you call the secularist nationalist forces have quite a job ahead of them from your remarks, especially on the issue of democracy, progressive economic change, and so on. But I want to go back to the Palestinian delegation. These people in Washington are different. They're not really PLO. They're from the occupied territories. They're pragmatic, and they're a different kind of leaders. But still, obviously, they have failed, or they have inched very, very slowly. So, how do you evaluate their work, and what would you recommend them to do? I mean, do you have any suggestions to them? What prospects for success do they have?
Well, my feeling is first of all, you know, I mean, there's plenty of criticisms you can make of the PLO. I mean, I've been very critical of them for 20 years, and I think they're one of the most inefficient, incompetent, and corrupt third world movements I've ever had anything to do with, I should tell you. But nevertheless, it is not correct to say that they were not pragmatic. I mean, the PLO right through the 80s, they did it sort of stupidly and incompetently, but they continually came forward with proposals for negotiations leading to mutual recognition. I mean, that's just a fact. You know, you can love them or hate them or whatever, but that's a fact. In this respect, they were no different from Hanan Ashrawi and any of the other West Bank leaders. They are more sophisticated, you're right. They're middle class, sophisticated, you know, urbane, and so on. That sells to the American audience better, but notice how it sells. They're getting a very good press, but look closely at the acclaim, right? The acclaim is, you know, you read in the New York Times, Clyde Haberman or, you know, any of these guys, they're just full of praise for the Palestinian leadership because they have finally self-accommodated to reality and are no longer making unrealistic demands for independence. So therefore, they're nice guys. They're doing what we tell them. Now, I'm not saying that they're selling out, but I'm saying that their forthcoming attitude is being hailed because it's being interpreted as it sort of filters through the U.S. doctrinal system as self-accommodation with reality, reality being we run the show and everybody does what we say. Well, you know, you ask what alternative they have, I don't think they have a lot of an alternative. I mean, one good thing that they're doing is for the first time, they're presenting the Palestinian case, which was always there, with some plausibility to an American audience. Now, people have been trying to get the PLO to do this for years. I don't know how much you've been in on these discussions, but I've been involved. Ed Said's been involved, others, all kind of meetings and so on. They never saw the slightest reason to try to appeal to the American people. They had ample opportunities. They had huge resources. They just didn't see the point. And I think there are all kind of reasons for that. Anyhow, that's what the truth was. I mean, I think it's the only third world movement I've ever had any contact with that didn't see the point of trying to, say, help build a solidarity movement, appeal to the American people. I mean, even the North Koreans, in their own crazy way, tried to do this. They'd send the Pyongyang Times around or something. But and that's really important, you know, because it's only popular pressures in the United States that can, first of all, constrain force and sometimes change policy. You know, you're not going to appeal to guys in smoke-filled rooms, the way they think business is done. They understand perfectly well they're going to do it their way. Well, the new leadership is doing that. Whether it'll make any difference or not seems to me to depend on whether, in fact, a significant solidarity movement develops, which could influence and change American policy. Short of that, it's not going to happen. Short of that, we'll get the New York Times version. You know, nice guys, self-accommodating to reality, doing what we tell them. And I wouldn't criticize what they've been doing. I don't think they have a lot of options. I mean, there are people in the occupied territories who are strongly opposed to the participation. I disagree with them. I think they should participate, but without illusions. Right after the Madrid conference opened, there were tremendous illusions in the occupied territories. You know, there was a sense we finally, you know, got the U.S. on our side, everything's going to change, we're going to march on to victory. I thought that was very dangerous. And I think by now, as far as I can tell from my Palestinian friends there, the illusions have pretty much disappeared. The trouble is that elimination of the illusions, which are unrealistic, can lead to other forms of irrationality. I think it's kind of unpredictable, and it's kind of not our business anyway. They'll do what they do. Our business would be to, as I see it, to try to build up the kind of solidarity movement which would enable those initiatives to get some support and to pressure U.S. policy. After all, that's the only thing under our influence, not what happens in Ramallah.
You said you read the Arab or the Egyptian press, and the next day you knew that it was a lie what you read in the New York Times. How do you know what newspaper to believe when they're lying?
It's not to believe. I mean, if the New York Times says Egypt is supporting our position on backing Saddam Hussein, you can look at El Ahram and find out if Egypt is backing the U.S. position on supporting Saddam Hussein. And they weren't. They were denouncing it. That's just a fact. It's not a matter of who you believe. You know, the fact of the matter, unquestionable fact, is that the major El Ahram is, you know, it's the major paper, the respectable paper in Egypt. Its editor came out with a big denunciation of the U.S. policy of supporting Saddam Hussein the day before the New York Times reported that they were supporting our policy. Okay, there's the facts. Now, you know, what Egypt's actual policy was, that you can speculate about. But this is a semi-governmental paper. You know, Al Ahram does not publish things that are in conflict with the position of the government of Egypt. It's the expression of, you know, kind of semi-official. You know, it's not the official newspaper, but really close. I mean, the New York Times is just flat out lying because that was the requirement at the time. Doesn't make any difference. Nobody's ever going to, I mean, it's exposed in the alternative press, but they don't care. You know, they don't care if they're exposed in Z Magazine. Just laugh.
To go back onto the point of Germany and Japan, I like what you said about in some way of the opening of Russia and the Eastern Bloc onto Germany and Japan, and that they did not need to depend anymore on the Middle East for oil. Does that mean, though, that they do not need to fear the U.S. Leverage on the oil, and that they can play a bigger role in the Middle East peace process, a more independent role?
Well, first of all, let me not exaggerate. I don't think they're losing their concern over the Middle East. You know, first of all, remember, this talk about an oil deal with Russia is a guess. I haven't seen any evidence for it. It just looks to me natural, you know. But even if it goes through, they're still going to be dependent on Middle East oil. Whatever they do, the major, cheap, available energy resource is the Arabian Peninsula and that region. That's going to remain that way for a long time. So yes, they'll be dependent, maybe less dependent, but dependent on the Gulf region. And but I think they're now more willing to recognize U.S. domination of it without any even symbolic interference. Partly for that reason, partly because of the success of the use of force, in which they can't compete. And they can compete economically, but not militarily. They have backed out of the peace process. I hate to use a term, but this thing that's called the peace process, they've backed out of. In fact, the backing out is pretty remarkable. It's not just that the European community has abandoned all of its own positions, as it has. They're no longer calling for Palestinian self-determination, you'll notice. This is the first year that, year isn't over yet, but it's the first UN session that I can remember when there was no proposal for an international conference and recognition of the Palestinian self-determination. No proposal. The Arab states didn't feel pressed to make their symbolic gesture to placate their own populations, and the European community didn't care. That's changed. Furthermore, it's interesting if you read the European press now, it's pretty remarkable. In fact, the European press is now totally brainwashed by the United States on this issue. They just repeat the propaganda they heard yesterday from the United States. I mean, the level of critical discussion has declined radically. Actually, that happened during the Gulf War in a most astonishing fashion. It was, I must say, personally, I saw it pretty dramatically. First of all, I happened to be in England when the war started, and I was on BBC every day from 7 o'clock in the morning till midnight, partly because they couldn't get anybody in England to criticize, to give any critical comment. The next couple of months, that happened all over Europe. I mean, I spent probably 100 hours on European, Australian radio and television, primarily because they couldn't get any local people to give, the European intellectuals just sold out. Not 100%, there's like 5 people who were talking. But as a class, they just essentially accepted the U.S. position. They got very jingoistic and so on. And by now, you read, say, the British press or the French press or something, they're just repeating U.S. propaganda on the Middle East. So it's the peace process and, James Baker's gets the Nobel Prize and so on and so forth. Well, that, I think, is a reflection of their backing off. Sorry? Sorry.
Would you expect that to change in the next, say, 10 years as the EC grows in power?
It could. It could. I mean, yeah.
Need to follow the Europeans more with the breaking up of NATO or the changing up of NATO?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of changes could happen in the next 10 years. Of that kind, I think, it's kind of unpredictable. But if the EC moves toward, it has the capacity to become the world's leading economic power by a substantial margin. And if they play the cards right, that's what will happen.
And could that in turn affect the state of the Middle East in a reversal way of how the current trend is?
Well, it depends on whether the U.S. is. I mean, right now, they are in a position of let's not exaggerate. The U.S. is still the major economic power in the world, despite the last 10 years, still the biggest market, the richest economy, and everything else. But it's declining. And its long-term prospects are not particularly bright because of the huge indebtedness and the destruction of infrastructure and everything else. If tendencies continue like this, then over time, what you're saying will be correct. The EC will have greater economic clout, and probably so will Japan, though lesser. If they really move into Russia the way they might, they'll even have resource access and market access of the kind they haven't had in the past from a big third world area. That could shift things. But if things continue as they are, the U.S. dominance of the Middle East will largely rely on force. And that's a tricky thing. Force is not easy to use. For one thing, the domestic base for use of force in the United States has eroded, collapsed virtually. There's very little popular acceptance now. There's been a big change, although despite all the breastfeeding and so on, the administration knows perfectly well that they don't have a domestic base for violence. And it's continuing. It's been growing for the last 20, 30 years. It's called the Vietnam Syndrome or one thing or another. And it keeps expanding. In the 1980s, the U.S. was unable in Central America to do what it traditionally did when there was problems there. They couldn't send the Marines, couldn't send the B-52s. They had to do clandestine terror because there's just too much domestic opposition. Even the Gulf illustrated that. In fact, the day that the combat started, there was a very important leak, which nobody paid enough attention to. There was a leak of a high-level administration planning document from early 1989, the early days of the Bush administration, on confrontations with the third world. And what it was said is very important. It said, in the case of a confrontation with a much weaker enemy, meaning any third world country like Iraq, in the case of a confrontation with a much weaker enemy, we must not only defeat them, but we must defeat them rapidly and decisively, because anything else will undercut political support, which is understood to be very thin. So the options for the use of force are either clandestine terror, which sort of kept from people, or else huge propaganda campaigns to build up somebody to, Attila the Hun, and then rapidly and decisively defeat them after the whole American population is terrified, and get it over fast because there's no political support for continuing. Well, that narrows the options for intervention. That's the success of the popular movements of the last years. And it makes it harder to use this weapon. I suspect that that'll increase. So, reliance on force to dominate the region is not reliable. And yes, I think you're right. Over, say, 10 years, these factors may modify for these reasons.
There is one use of government force that seems to be gaining increasing acceptance in the United States, the death penalty. And that's one issue that seems, there's one policy that the sole function truly seems to be purely propagandistic.
I don't agree. I think it's more than that. See, it's not just the death penalty. The Reagan-Bush administrations are very strongly opposed to civil rights. They're not conservative. That's just a fraud. Any old-fashioned conservative, like, say, Robert Taft, would turn over in his grave to see what's called conservative today. These guys are radical statists. They want a powerful, violent state, interferes massively in economic affairs, protects itself from interference by the public, and demolishes the civil rights system. It's not just the death penalty. Like, one concomitant of the drug war, and probably one of its main purposes, was to create a whole network of possibilities to undermine and destroy the civil liberties protection for the poorer sectors of the population, who, of course, are also targeted by the death penalty. And remember, the United States is moving towards a third world society, too, in certain respects. It's been dramatic over the past 10 years. There's a move towards a two-tiered society. It's a rich country, so it's not going to look like Brazil, but a substantial sector of very wealthy and a huge population that's superfluous. Corporations don't need them for labor. They can get it cheaper in northern Mexico. There's nothing to do with these people. You got to control them somehow. It happens that there's close correlation in the United States between class and race, so that helps too. It's kind of racially identified more or less. Though it's really a class thing, basically. Like the poor white working class is basically the same. And these people have to be controlled somehow. Well, you can coop them up in their cities. You can stick them in prison. You have to have the rights of the police to go in and do things to them and so on. I think these are all of a piece, and they sort of fall out of the socioeconomic programs of the last 10 years.
1 second, I just have to make a very quick announcement. Whoever has an Eagle with license plate CXN 9916, move their car. Sorry.
Okay.
Support.
Yeah. There's support, but I think that's a little bit like the very thin support that developed for attacking Iraq. This is a very frightened country. There's no doubt about it. The United States is remarkable, and in fact, to some extent, has become an object of ridicule in Europe because everybody's so terrified. So, for example, like during the Gulf War, Americans were afraid to travel to Europe. That was a big joke all over Europe. What's going to happen if they travel to Europe? In 1986, when the Reaganites pulled this propaganda trick with Libya as a punching bag, the whole tourist industry in Europe was destroyed because Americans were afraid to travel. There's going to be Arab terrorists hiding, trying to kill you or something. And again, it was an object of ridicule in Europe. But that's part of the system too. You want to, if the U.S. is going to use force to control things, it's going to have a frightened population at home. People are scared enough so they're willing to tolerate the use of force. And there's a constant barrage, of directed against the domestic population to frighten them. In fact, that's another part of what the drug war is about. One thing the drug war had nothing to do with is drugs. That's for certain. In fact, I don't think there's any discussion about that. But it had other purposes. One purpose was to mobilize the American population in fear. Don't forget, you can't appeal to the evil empire anymore. It's just not there. The best PR system can't make you afraid of Stalin. So you need something different. And you got to keep the population frightened. That's the only way you can control them, especially when you're moving towards policies of the kind you mentioned, repressive policies at home. They got to be frightened. They're not going to accept these things. And you're right, people are frightened. Yeah. Well, election, I don't know, but I don't know what the election has much to do with it. But it seems to me it suggests a strategy, namely the usual one. Try to get people to open their eyes and to organize and so on.
I have two-part question. First, regarding the Israelis right now, the two parties they're trying to pull out from the government. Do you think this is a tactic by the Israeli government to delay the peace process, in your opinion, or what?
Well,
the second one is the $10 billion question.
Yeah, right. Just yesterday or today, Tria and Moledet, these two right-wing parties pulled out, which sort of eliminates the government majority. I don't know if it was a tactic, but I suspect the government is not all that unhappy about it, because one of its effects will be to scotch the discussions which they don't like. Yeah, it means you delay it. Yeah, and that's what they want. Plainly, they don't want to be, it's a nuisance. I don't expect much to happen, but the whole thing is a nuisance and a bad propaganda show and so on. And now you can have some talk about, here's the greatest democracy in history, so we got to adhere to the democratic process and so on and so forth. You can write the editorials yourself. So we're not faced with that. But I wouldn't, I doubt that it was like a planned tactic. I mean, I think it reflects internal Israeli politics. There's a big problem in Israel, remember, about who's going to pick up the mantle after Shamir goes. It's getting pretty old. So who's going to take it over? And there's a lot of jockeying for power about that. A lot of the stuff about the settlements is really internal politics. Like Ariel Sharon wants to take over, and he knows his base of support is right-wing settlers, so he pushes that. The $10 billion question. Well, that's going to be interesting, actually. The $10 billion is basically for the occupied territories, whatever they pretend, I think people basically understand that. Israel has the funds to absorb refugees, just using them for the territory. They're using about $2 billion a year for settlement of the territories. That's about what they'd get if they got the loan guarantees. So that's not the issue. There's also a number of quite serious questions about the Soviet refugees. Like, why are they being forced to Israel? That's not a humanitarian thing. Most of them don't want to go to Israel. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, there was very little reporting here, but there was a really horrifying episode in Holland where several hundred, I forget how many, fair number of Russian Jewish refugees, actually, a lot of them weren't Jewish, but that's pretended Russian Jewish refugees, fled from Israel to Holland, which is, standard asylum. Israel, as always, put a lot of pressure on Holland not to accept them. Israel does not want refugees to be accepted. Holland acceded. They're very pro-Israel. And they forcefully sent them back to Israel. A very ugly scene. The Israeli press covered this extensively. They watch people being dragged off the plane by Dutch and Israeli police in tears. They don't want to be in this horrible place and so on. The American press kept it pretty quiet, but there's a lot of coverage in the Israeli press. Just before that, the head of the Knesset Committee of Absorption and Immigration, Michael Kleiner, wrote an article in Israel in which he complained about the fact that Germany was willing to accept a small number of Russian Jews, and he said what he was going to do. I mean, here's what he said. He said he's going to go to Germany, and he's going to tell the Germans that, I'm quoting, it's Hebrew, but I'm translating, he's going to tell the Germans that they have already fulfilled their quota for discrimination with regard to Jews in this century. And they got to stop. They got to treat the Jews like everyone else. They don't let anyone else in. Don't let the Russian Jews in. So use the Holocaust as a weapon to prevent them from taking in Russian Jews. There was very little criticism of this, I should say, because it's kind of accepted. They've used the same weapon in the United States. So it's considered anti-Semitic for Western countries to accept Russian immigrants. Not that they would accept that many anyway. They don't want them. But there are pressures to drive them to Israel. As far as the humanitarian aspects of it are concerned, whatever the status of Russian Jews is in Russia, and it's not nice, it's not one of the big humanitarian problems in the world. I mean, just to take the obvious one, compare it with the state of roughly equivalent number of Palestinian refugees in Jordan. They didn't leave Kuwait because, the economy is collapsing. They left Kuwait because they were driven out and tortured and so on and so forth, and they're moving to a poor country that doesn't get $10 billion in loans. So just to pick one example, right next door there's a much worse humanitarian problem, and you can think of plenty of others. So it's not a humanitarian issue. I mean, whatever it is, it's not a humanitarian issue. And what's more, the Israeli press is quite frank about this. They say, look, let's stop the crap. Yes, okay, because, you just can't, you can sell it if you like, but it's a fraud. As soon as you look at it, it's obvious, whatever it is, it's not a humanitarian issue. Now, up until recently, until the American economy started seriously declining, my assumption was that the loan would sail through. But now it's not so certain, because there's a myth that the United States is very munificent and gives a lot of aid to the world. That's a complete myth. The United States is one of the lowest aid donors, and most of the so-called aid is export promotion or something like that. But there is that myth, we're the big benefactor and we give away everything and so on and so forth. And one consequence of the relative, the kind of economic decline is a growing sentiment in the country, the kind of thing, expressed by people like Patrick Buchanan, that we got to stop giving away everything to the whole world. Well, okay, that means there's a big popular base now for opposing a loan that would have sailed through if the Bush administration wants to oppose it. Now, it'll be interesting to see what they do. They can easily block it if they like. My guess is they're going to push it through because I think they want it to go through in some fashion. There may be some finagling. And I suspect, my guess, of course, that they'll, other things being equal, they'll probably push it through because they want to increase the settlements in the occupied territories. I mean, the U.S. can pretend all it likes that it's opposed to the settlements in the occupied territories, but as long as the U.S. keeps funding them, that's not true. The U.S. has always been funding the settlements in the occupied territories. The pretense is we're just standing by helplessly while this, powerful state does what it feels like. I mean, that's not even a joke. The U.S. wants to stop the settlements, it can stop them in 3 minutes.
Would we just take maybe 2 more questions in light of the time?
What chance do you see in that there could be enough resistance on the West Bank and also a peace movement in the Israel that would be in solidarity with the opposition in the West Bank to make it politically, to make Israel want a political solution? That would be favorable to the Palestinians. Is that a fairy tale?
I don't think it's a fairy tale, but I think it depends a lot on what happens here. Israel is so dependent on the United States that nobody can get any political credibility in Israel unless they have backing in the U.S. That's why when Israeli doves come here, real Israelis, say Monty Pellet and these people, they plead with Americans to try to develop some kind of peace movement. Because otherwise there's no hope for any comparable Israeli group to develop. They're just too dependent on the U.S. As far as things developing in the occupied territories, I think it's extremely unlikely. They took a real beating in the last year, as far as I can tell. But if there are changes here, it could support, pro-accommodation elements within Israel. Sure, it could happen. If it doesn't happen here, it's not going to happen there, I don't think.
One more.
So what should we be doing to build our movement? Should we be telling people to write to Bush or putting ads in the paper or... what are the tactics that are going to work to build a movement here?
You got to judge tactics in your own local situation. I don't know. I mean, what the right tactics are depends on what's happening where you are. Like you can't decide what happens in Seattle, and I have no advice as to what happens here. But the techniques for organizing and, just giving out information and so on, they're not a big secret. They've never changed. It basically takes energy, No, we're talking about the change in American media, and the change in American media is positive.
But I think wouldn't you agree that American media should not be relied upon in the dissemination of this kind of...
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's not a... Look, I mean, I don't know if we're kind of missing years or something. When I say that the press coverage of the Iraq War was better than the coverage of the Vietnam War, I mean, it wasn't, like the worst form of totalitarianism, was like a slightly more relaxed form of totalitarianism. Well, that's an improvement. And that improvement comes from the impact of the popular movement. And that tells you something. It tells you if there's more impact, there can be more improvement.
Well, the improvement is seen in the change of the treatment between Peter Arnett and Jane Fonda. Some people doubted even the patriotism of Peter Arnett because
Yeah, but notice how much of an improvement that is over the Vietnam War when nobody was in the NLF territory. Nobody.
Yeah, they called for James Buchanan.
And she went to Hanoi. You know. Yeah. What was that? Going to Hanoi was nothing. You could go to the Swedish embassy in Hanoi. Well, okay, that's what I'm saying. It's better now. You know. So now there's some kind of right-wing critique of P. Arnett is called controversial. You know, but he's not. But there was no Peter Arnett during the Indochina War.
When it comes to the Israeli or Palestine, I think the media coverage is much worse.
I don't agree.
For example, not only they don't cover it at all, and the blowing of bombs and all the atrocities which are continuously being committed against the Palestinians, but worse than that. Robert Siegel, his NPR reporting, he was glorifying the Israeli settlers. I mean, making the American population look at these as heroes.
That's right. And this is much better than it was. Much better than it was in the 70s. In the 1970s, there was, first of all, now there is some coverage. So, for example, in Siloam and places like that, there was not only coverage, but pretty accurate coverage. In the 70s and the early 80s, there was nothing. And the same atrocities were going on. And then that was the time when the New York Times was running editorials about, the most benign occupation in human history and so on and so forth. No, that's not what they're not doing anymore. See, your point is, I think you're, like I half agree, but you got to put it the right way. We have to be accurate. The coverage is offensive and disreputable, but it's better, much better. For example, I've been writing about this for the last 20 years and detailing, mostly from the Israeli press, the atrocities that are going on. And, up until the late 80s, there was virtually no reporting. I mean, there was one moment, 1981, 82, when things were really bad for a couple of weeks. And a lot of people were getting killed, and then there was some marginal reporting. But most of the time, it was essentially nothing. Now, in the last couple of years, there's been a fair amount of reporting. Not adequate, but a fair amount. And there is now the kind of critique of the settler movement that you never had back in the 70s. Well, that's a change. And you see the same change in the population. I mean, again, like talks on the Middle East, audiences are radically different than they were. And that's been going all the way through. In the early 70s, you tried to make the most mild comment, you get killed, literally. Now, in most of the country, outside of, maybe Los Angeles and New York, you find audiences which are very critical of Israel, and big audiences. In fact, I've had experiences in the Midwest where I ended up defending Israel because the level of anti-Semitism was so extreme, and the attacks were so unfair that, I thought they went too far. That's a change. Yeah, let's ask somebody else a chance. Yeah.
I'm wondering if one of the possible reasons why Bush mobilized the National Guard to send them to the Middle East was to transform the image of the National Guard in the eyes of the American public, to clean up Quayle's image. I was wondering on a scale, where would you put that on a scale from 0 to paranoid delusion?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about it, frankly. Maybe you're right.
To totally change subjects for a moment, I'm wondering if you have any comments about what I'm getting very nervous about in this country. Maybe it's 0 to paranoid delusion, about big business seeming to want to get involved more and more with taking over the public education. We know the relationship of corporations with university education, but now I see it as kind of an insidious, quiet movement to get workers for big business by going into the lower levels.
Well, I think you're right, but that's part of a much bigger move. It's a move towards cutting back public services for the general population altogether. I mean, it's on a par with letting the cities collapse and letting the highways collapse and cutting back welfare and so on. And that's something that's been going on since the early 70s. It has to do with what I mentioned before, this crisis that Nixon faced. In the early 1970s, there was a big crisis in the capitalist world altogether. And it became worse in the early 80s. There was the level of profits were declining. There were three major competitive centers. The U.S. was declining relative to the other two. All of the countries, all of the states turned to more or less the same policies because they were all responding to pretty much the same crisis. They did it at different levels, but it was all what's called conservatism. There's nothing conservative about it. It was all basically, trying to divert public resources even more than before towards wealthy sectors, banks, investors, and so on. And that means declining services to the general public. And that goes on worldwide. It's called privatization in the third world. And what you're talking about is just a piece of it. The state is supposed to be a welfare state for the wealthy. It always was, but now more than ever, because there are problems of corporate profits and so on. And so, for example, since the 1970s, there's been a steady decline of real wages, either stagnation or decline for about maybe 2/3 of the population. In fact, and wage earners, non-administrative wage earners, I think are about at the level of 1960 by now. The only way in which families are keeping going is by 2 wage earners in a family, which means other costs and other social costs and so on. And that's just part of it. And that same thing in England, and the same to an extent happening in the continent, it will be happening in Japan. It means the third world gets it in the neck because they're the first ones to suffer. That's what all these IMF structural adjustment programs are about. And this is a worldwide problem. And the privatization of the schools is part of it. The effect of privatization of the schools will mean that the rich will get good education and other people get nothing. Now, I think there are tendencies in the other direction too. Like, for example, for the first time, the U.S., as I'm sure you know, is the only industrial country outside of South Africa that doesn't have national health insurance. There are all kind of reasons for that. But by now, for the first time, there's business pressure for it. And the reason is the costs are getting too high for industry, for their own needs. So, there's a cost accounting operation going on. So, but yes, there's a lot of pressure on much of the population is largely superfluous in a period with internationalization of capital, migration of production to cheaper areas, supranational banks, and so on and so forth. Much of the population just hasn't had any role. So you kind of stick them in jails or inner cities or something and cut down the level of services to the point where they will prey on each other or something.
Syria and other Arab countries, it was strictly forbidden to broadcast the proceedings of the Madrid conference in the Middle East. In contrast, the duty-free Israeli press, and that's a great question to me that I didn't really, I was never familiar with the conditions of the free Israeli press.
It's very free. It's a very good, it's very, it's very ideologically biased, but we learn a lot from it, especially the Hebrew press. The English press, the Jerusalem Post, is a different story because, they figure the Jerusalem Post people are going to read. The Hebrew press is regarded as kind of like a secret language. This is a tribe, remember. It's a tribe which keeps its secrets to itself. You don't let outsiders know about it. And you got a secret language which nobody reads unless they're a member of the tribe. So you can be pretty frank. And if you read the Hebrew press, you can learn a lot. I mean, by far the best coverage of the occupied territories are Lebanon and Hebrew press for years and years. It's true that on international affairs the coverage is not great, but that's like most small countries or even big. You take, say, the Toronto Globe and Mail. Canada's not a small country, and the Toronto Globe and Mail is a big newspaper. Actually, I monitored it for a year because I was going to give some lectures for CBC on the media, and I thought I would talk about their newspaper. You couldn't. I mean, the Toronto Globe and Mail is like probably the local Raleigh newspaper. It's very parochial. They're small. Most places are small towns. Washington and New York are big, are world capitals. London is to a certain extent. Israel is mostly a small town. You have very good, it's very open press, that's true. There are a lot of very good, very courageous and honest journalists in the Hebrew press, and occasionally the English press. But the coverage is broken. It's only not entirely. For example, the one article I have ever found so far on the current situation in South Vietnam, including, in fact, what I was referring to on the Saigon hospitals and the fetuses and so on, was from an Israeli journalist who was visiting South Vietnam. Very good Israeli journalist. He could press.
Is there censorship?
Yeah, there's military censorship, but it's racist. It's mostly against Arabs. There's some censorship against Jews, but not very much because they're inside the tribe. But I can sense it when I visit there. I can sense it. If you want to be in a very protected position in Israel, what you should do is talk Hebrew with an American accent, because then you've got every possible advantage. You talk Hebrew, you're a member of the tribe. You got an American accent. You come from those rich guys who keep us going. I was able to go with friends into refugee camps that were under military occupation, breaking military curfew, and you get kicked up and so on. But as soon as you start talking Hebrew with an American accent, it kind of very relaxes. Racism is a very powerful phenomenon. But one effect of it is one aspect of it is the Israeli press the Hebrew press in particular happens to be very good. I assume that NPR report was quite accurate. I'd be very surprised if there was any constraint on reporting of the Madrid conference. In fact, they give very acid reports. You read the Israeli press, mainstream Israeli press, equivalent of the New York Times, and there are articles there by one of their top journalists. I quoted in my last article, Z, saying that what the U.S. and Israel want in these Madrid talks is autonomy for the Palestinians, which will be the autonomy of the POW camp, where the prisoners are autonomous to cook their own meals and run cultural events. Then he goes on to explain why. He says, for Israel to really annex, he says, no advocate of greater Israel has ever called for annexation of the territories, because that would be absurd. If you annex the territories, you've got the problem of how to handle the situation, the population. The population then is guaranteed the second-level rights of Israeli Arab citizens. It's true that they're second-class citizens, but they're some kind of citizens. Like you've got to keep a minimal level of welfare and survival going for them. And you have to extend that to the territories, which would be a huge cost. So it's much better for them to be autonomous. Then you don't offer them anything, and you take heavy taxes from them. So it's perfect. Well, you're not going to read that in the New York Times. And that's typical.
I sometimes wonder whether or not I'm a little too optimistic about the periods coming up ahead. I know there's going to be a big burden and horrible things happening within the capitalist domain, but sometimes I think it might be very positive because in the alternative communities, I see like black activist groups confronting feminism, feminist activist groups confronting racism, the ecological groups confronting both of those problems, and very sophisticated, and it seems like maybe we've gotten rid of some of the somewhat like religious, like, Maoist or this or thatist things. Am I wrong?
No, I agree with you totally. Absolutely agree with you. In fact, as far as the American left is concerned, I think the collapse of the Soviet system was a step forward. They were always passionately anti-socialist back to 1917, and that's just another impediment going. And I also agree with you about the popular movements. It is positive. I mean, I guess, maybe I'm crazy, but I thought that the Iraq War experience showed the power of the left and the peace movement by comparison to anything before. It wasn't enough to stop it, but it was, by comparison to anything before, it was a big advance.
But there hasn't been any coverage afterwards of the devastation of the entire
That's not
area.
true.
Well, I mean, there hasn't been massive
Look,
coverage.
Frontline, for example, ran an hour by Andrew and Leslie Coburn, which was extremely good. Very good. And, you know, there have been other things. That's a lot different from what we used to get. Okay, that's something. I'd take, say, maybe even NPR is pretty rotten. But NPR did get pretty extensive coverage for this Census Bureau report on the post-war Iraqi casualties. Well, that wouldn't happen before.